All right, the next one is menopause. Here I wrote menopause ovaries are unresponsive to FSH. So when a woman reaches approximately 50 years old, what actually happens is she still has FSH that's released from the anterior pituitary, but for some reason, when the FSH binds to the follicular cells, the follicle cells of the ovarian follicle, the follicle cells can't release estrogen, right? And if these follicle cells cannot release estrogen, right, what's going to happen? You don't have establishment of the uterine lining. And if you can't do that, then you cannot progress in potential childbirth, right? Typically, we say that a woman's eggs, right, not we, but some books have said that it's considered as the woman's eggs being burned out, right? At some point in her life, around 50s, right, FSH is still being released in high amounts, right? It binds onto the FSH receptors of the follicle cells, but estrogen is not being released. In fact, as a woman gets older, less and less estrogen is being produced. Next up is birth control. Notice I put birth control as progesterone, right? We're going to take a step back. We're going to look at this pathway before this is happening. Remember, this is happening in the luteal phase, which is day 14 through day 28 of the menstrual cycle. Notice which hormone dominates from day 14 to day 28. It's luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is released by the anterior pituitary, binds onto a luteinizing receptor site on the follicle cells, and it causes the follicle cells to release progesterone. Progesterone causes vascularization of the uterine lining. At some point, if you do not have any more progesterone, you do not have vascularization of the uterine lining, then towards the end of the menstrual cycle, the woman will shed and have her period. That's called menstruation, right? What actually causes the decrease in progesterone? Well, one thing I didn't tell you before, which you do need to know, is that progesterone actually has a negative feedback effect, right? Progesterone will bind onto a progesterone receptor site on the anterior pituitary. It's going to shut off the LH, and eventually if you shut off the LH, you're going to shut off the progesterone release. If you shut off the progesterone release, you do not have any more vascularization of the uterine lining, and all of a sudden, the woman will have her period. Now, let's look into what happens as a form of birth control, why women take progesterone, right? How does that actually work? If a woman were to take progesterone, right, progesterone actually tricks the body, right? So for example, if a woman were to take progesterone, which is right over here, right, something that looks like progesterone, the progesterone that she's taking in her body will actually have a negative feedback loop, just like regular progesterone that would be produced by her corpus luteum. But in this case, she's taking it. So if she takes progesterone, progesterone will bind onto the anterior pituitary, and it's going to cause the release of LH, right? I'm sorry, let me take that back. It's going to inhibit the release of LH because progesterone has a negative feedback loop. So let me say that again. A woman takes progesterone as birth control. That binds onto the anterior pituitary. It shuts off the release of LH. If it shuts off the release of LH, will there be an egg that's released in the abdominal cavity of a woman during her menstrual cycle? In other words, will ovulation occur? And the answer is no, because notice what we needed in order for ovulation to occur. Remember, I said before in the earlier videos that you need that LH surge for the ovulation to occur. Again, this is a very high yield question. You need the LH surge to release the egg. If you do not have the LH surge as a result of the negative feedback loop produced by this medication of progesterone, then you do not have ovulation. So birth control is essentially tricking the body's feedback loops. Next up, let's talk about pregnancy, right? At a certain point, let's say, let me just erase this. Actually, I won't erase this. I'm going to erase this part. Let's say this fertilized egg, this is actually called a blastocyst. Once it's fertilized, it's first the zygote, then it's called a blastocyst, and then it's going to implant in the uterine lining, right? Let's say at some point, this becomes a full fetus, right? And then there's placenta. There's a huge placenta here, right? The placenta actually releases a hormone, right? There's actually an outer portion of the placenta called the chorion, right? And the chorion actually releases a hormone called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. And I have this written for you over here. Now notice I said human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. It's actually what's tested for in pregnancy kits, right? That's an LH analog. So what do I mean by an LH analog? An LH analog, again, acts the same as LH. In other words, it looks like LH, it acts essentially like LH, but they're calling it human chorionic gonadotropin. Now, what was the job of LH? Right, LH will trigger the corpus luteum to release progesterone, and progesterone will continue the vascularization of the uterine lining. If we continue the vascularization of the uterine lining, right, as long as we have some type of progesterone, right, we don't care how we make it, right, the woman will not have her period here. If there's vascularization in this region, right, she will not shed and menstruate. So again, what's triggering that? Well, the HCG is being produced, right, by the placenta. Let me actually just do... right, and what the HCG is doing is it's binding on the follicle cells, and it's causing the release of progesterone. Progesterone is continuously vascularizing the uterine lining. And if that uterine lining is continuously vascularized, meaning there's a continuous supply of blood vessels, the woman will not have her period. And that is a sign of pregnancy. So HCG is a common test they usually test for to see if a woman is pregnant. She usually has high levels of HCG. Let's talk about an ectopic pregnancy. Now, I told you that typically the egg, the fertilized egg, we actually call this a blastocyst, right? Once it's fertilized, it's right. Actually, I should even draw it like that, because a blastocyst looks more like this. You can't really see the sperm anymore, right? Let's say the blastocyst, which is essentially the stage after a zygote, it implants in the uterine lining. That's normal. Is it possible for the blastocyst to implant somewhere else besides the uterine lining? And the answer is yes. If it implants anywhere outside of that uterine lining, we call it an ectopic pregnancy, right? Where can it typically implant? Well, think about this. We said fertilization occurs in a woman's fallopian tube, right? That's the sperm in black. The green is the egg. Is it possible for that zygote, right, or a blastocyst, or that fertilized egg, to actually implant in the fallopian tube? And the answer is yes, right? One reason is, there are many reasons why. There could be a deficiency in the cilia inside the fallopian tube. It could be from, an untreated STD, right? There are many reasons. And that's really bad. If the fertilized egg is actually implanted in the fallopian tube, right, the fetus will actually continue to develop in the fallopian tube, and it's going to expand the fallopian tube. It can actually kill a woman, right? Here's a diagram, right, of an ectopic pregnancy. All right, I'm just going to write ectopic. Right, the blue arrows actually show you the uterine lining of a woman, right? These arrows over here, this is the fallopian tube, right? These are the ovaries, right? Notice this is a fallopian tube with an expanded fetus. So the fetus, the fertilized egg implanted in the fallopian tube. And it's growing now in the fallopian tube. That's where the red arrows are pointed, right? That is a very dangerous pregnancy. And typically, I'm not saying always, sometimes you have to abort that pregnancy.